church begins. We continue on our series in the book of Acts, the church begins. Today we're going to look at persecution. The world was changing. It had been turned upside down, particularly for the Jewish people. They were still under the rule of the odious Romans in the land that God had given them. For centuries they had been expectant of a Messiah, a King, a Christ, to rise up and rid them of their oppressors. And when the Messiah, Jesus Christ, did come, they missed him. They had misunderstood what the Messiah was to do. The Messiah was not to lead a political revolution, as they thought, but rather to lead a spiritual revolution, bringing people back into relationship with God. The world view of the Jewish people needed to be changed, and when world views need wholesale change of focus, problems arise. The embryonic church, the new church, followers of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, was soon to feel pressure to revert back to old ways of thinking and doing. And it isn't long into the book of Acts, and therefore the history of the church, that persecution arises. And we see the first stages of this persecution in Acts chapter 4. As they spoke to the people, that's the Christians, the priests and the captain of the temple and the Sadducees came to them, being upset because they taught the people and proclaimed in Jesus the resurrection from the dead. They laid hands on them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was now evening. However, somewhat surprisingly, we then read, "But many of those who heard the word believed, and the number of men came to be about 5,000. And then at the beginning of chapter 6, we read about the first Christian martyr, Stephen. Stephen, we read in Acts chapter 6, verse 8, was full of faith and power and performed great wonders and signs among the people. But some of those who were of the synagogue called the Libertines, and of the Cyrenians, of the Alexandrians, and those of Cilicia and Asia arose, disputing with Stephen. They weren't able to withstand the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. Then they secretly induced men to say, 'We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God.' They stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes, and came against him and seized him and brought him into the council, and set up false witnesses who said, 'This man never stopped speaking blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs which Moses delivered to us.' All who sat in the council, fastening their eyes on Stephen, saw that his face was that like the face of an angel." Stephen had reminded the Jewish leaders that God did not dwell in buildings made from stone, as in the temple. For had not God also been with his servants in various places, such as Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Egypt? He reminded them also of how the Jews had always rejected God's messengers, and now finally they themselves had killed God's Son, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. He also reminded them that what made somebody a person after God's own heart was not the physical circumcision, but a circumcision of the heart, the ears, the soul. It was a spiritual revolution that occurred when people were in relationship with the living God, not just an outward appearance. So there was Stephen, filled and controlled by the Holy Spirit, with an angelic look on his face. And we see his love and faith put into practice when he exclaimed, "Don't hold this sin against them." And we see in Stephen's final words the reaction of a man, a person full of faith and filled with the Spirit, undergoing pressure. Stoning is an awful and excruciating way to die. And while Jesus had prayed to the Father in his dying moments, Stephen prayed also. But not to the Father. He prayed to Jesus. And it wasn't so long ago that Jesus was walking the earth. Indeed, perhaps on these very stones. And yet we already find prayers being made to him. Stephen sees Jesus in all his magnificent, glorious and heavenly majesty, and he can only cry out to him in such a way. Then finally he asks Jesus to forgive those who have killed him. Amazing, isn't it? I wonder how you and I would act under the same circumstances, the same conditions. Would we ask why and whinge and grumble and complain? Christians enduring persecution will one day be able to say with the likes of Stephen that it was all worth it. The sufferings I endured and overcame for the sake of Jesus was all worth it, so as to be here and living with him as my King forever. Persecution of Christians is only going to get stronger in the West. We can see the signs. We're going to get shouted down for saying that Jesus is the only way to heaven. And yet, like the apostles, we must also persist. I wonder if you notice one other name in that Bible passage. That name being Saul. He led systematic persecution of these Christians. And yet, as we shall soon find out, he will play a major role in the development of the church and of Christian thinking. For as the church father Augustine comments, if Stephen had not prayed, the church would not have had Paul. And despite all this persecution, the church continued to grow. And whenever and wherever the church has endured persecution, down through the ages, and including our modern times, for their belief in Jesus Christ, growth has always occurred. There are places in this world now where it is illegal to be a Christian, and yet amazingly, these churches are growing numerically, exponentially, just as we have seen occur in the New Testament. If the New Testament church had known that Jesus did not rise from the dead physically, would the church have grown like it has over 2,000 years? Would people like Stephen knowingly die or undergone systematic persecution for a known lie or mistruth? The very existence of the church is the greatest physical proof of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. The church, his church, nothing will stop its growth, and nothing will stop that glorious day, that one glorious day when Jesus Christ comes again to collect his followers, his bride, the church. We can see that the church has come under attack through persecution, and now a new crisis has appeared. Unable to destroy the church by way of persecution and deceit, Satan now tries his next ploy in order to create a split in the church by getting believers to argue and fight with each other. If Satan had succeeded in creating an implosion within this church, the only church in existence at the time, then the effects could have been devastating. I've had people tell me they want a church without any form of organizational structure. And I tell them that if a church has no organizational and leadership structure, then it will soon have chaos rather than harmony, and it will collapse rather than grow and serve. Of course, some leaders are corrupt or make wrong decisions, but godly leaders will not be corrupt. They will make decisions that are wise and based on prayer and spiritual insights. So, what was the problem? How did they solve the problem? And what happened after it was resolved? Reading from Acts chapter 6 verse 1. Now in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplying, a complaint arose from the Hellenists against the Hebrews, because their widows were neglected in the daily service. So there's good news. The church was growing, but this growth had caused a problem, which was the bad news, and that was some widows were not being cared for. And Hebraic Jews had always lived in the then nation of Israel, spoke mainly Aramaic and some Hebrew. They would have been well used to life in a Jewish society, the temple, and avoiding those who were not Jews, the Gentiles. Grecian or Hellenistic Jews were part of the Jewish diaspora, born elsewhere within the known world, and had returned to Jerusalem. These people mainly spoke Greek and were well used to working with the Gentiles or non-Jews. And we know from the Old Testament that widows were and are important to God, because justice is important to God, because God is a God of justice and mercy. And in the Old Testament, under the law of Moses, God commanded provision for those who are widows, oppressed, or uncared for. The apostles would have known about God caring for the widows, and in Jesus' teaching about justice for the poor and the oppressed. We know this because in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, people were willing and selling and sharing possessions and ensuring that people within the Christian community were being looked after and cared for. This included making sure that everyone got fed, particularly those who had no family to care for them. Somehow, unintentional or not, this group of widows were missing out. So what was the solution?